The second lesson this morning comes from 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. The first is found in chapter 8, verses 1 through 7, which can be found on page 1055 in your pew Bibles. And the second comes from 2 Corinthians 9, verses 6 through 15, which can be found on page 1056. Listen for the Lord to speak. We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches of Macedonia. For during a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For as I can testify, they voluntarily gave according to their means and even beyond their means, begging us earnestly for the privilege of sharing this ministry to the saints. And this not merely as we expected. They gave themselves first to the Lord and, by the will of God, to us, so that we might urge Titus, as he had already made a beginning, so he could also complete this generous undertaking among you. Now, as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in utmost eagerness, and in our love for you, so we want you to excel in this generous undertaking. And then from 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6 through 15. The point is this: the one who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the one who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each of you must give as you have made up your mind, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to provide you with every blessing in abundance, so that by always having enough of everything, you may share abundantly in every good work. As it is written, He scatters abroad, He gives to the poor, His righteousness endures forever. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way for your great generosity, which will produce thanksgiving to God through us. For the rendering of this ministry not only supplies the needs of the saints, but also overflows with many thanksgivings to God. Through the testing of this ministry, you glorify God by your obedience to the confession of the gospel of Christ and by the generosity of your sharing with them and with all others, while they long for you and pray for you because of the surpassing grace of God that He has given you. Thanks be to God for this indescribable gift. This is the word of the Lord. There are many things that separate us and remind us of our differences as humans. We come from different places with different preconceived ideas about the world in which we live and how it operates. And we are each experiencing life in a very unique manner. However, there are also many shared experiences which bind us together in our journey as human beings. One such experience happened when we were children. Someone important in our lives, perhaps a teacher, a grandparent, aunt, uncle, or most likely it was a parent, said something to us repeatedly, seeking a specific response that helped shape the way in which we engage the world around us. It is something so seminal, so important, that it has become ingrained in the very essence of our being. The scene probably went something like this. There you stand, age 5, with an important adult near you, and you are waiting to receive something for which you have asked, something you really, really wanted. Then, just before that object, and for the sake of argument, let's say it's an ice cream sandwich from the neighborhood ice cream truck. Not that this ever happened. So before that object hits your hand, this question comes out of the adult's mouth. And because of it, your world and your experience of the world has been forever changed. They said, "Now what do you say?" And as the ice cream sandwich is moving toward your hand, before they let it go, they say it again. "Now what do you say?" and they give you those adult eyes. Then, tumbling from your lips, come the two little magic words that have been ingrained in our brains as we've been trained to say them in situations just like this one. Thank you? Yes, thank you. And you are welcome, says the adult. But then, as soon as we think we have mastered the art of saying the words that apparently everyone wants to hear when we receive something, the game changes. We are told that we must now be willing to share. Are you kidding me? I asked for this ice cream sandwich because I wanted this ice cream sandwich. And now I not only have to say thank you, but I have to share it with my sister? Really? The adults, they tricked us. We were duped. Sharing doesn't come naturally, and neither does saying thank you. We are by nature kind of selfish. And we want to protect that which we think belongs to us. And why would we ever say thank you for something we thought we deserved in the first place? And that is exactly why it is important that those adults who loved us, guided us into these life-shaping disciplines. And it's why the adults seated in this congregation, it's why we do the same thing for the young people we love and with whom we share life. Now, we've come to know that this exercise ultimately really isn't even about saying thank you or sharing what we have with others. Becoming skilled in the art of saying thank you is not simply about allowing those two little words to tumble from our lips. It's really about gratitude. And in the same manner, mastering the discipline of sharing is not simply about the action of giving a portion of something that belongs to us to someone else. No, it's about generosity. These disciplined practices are what the Apostle Paul addresses to the beloved community in Corinth. The nature of his arguments resemble those we would make to those we love in our attempt to help them understand the importance of both gratitude and generosity. In our two epistle lessons this morning, we see Paul appealing to the Corinthians to take part in this offering that was being collected for the church in Jerusalem. It's kind of an odd request. But there were many reasons for this offering and why it was taken. The followers of the way in Jerusalem were likely under incredible economic stress. Many of them could not find jobs in the occupied land. There was also a sense that because this faith began in that land, the believers in other believing communities and cities all over the Mediterranean world should express their devotion to this faith by giving to the church out of which they all grew. Paul reminds the church in Corinth that without the church in Jerusalem, they would have never received the message of the gospel. Such an offering was also agreed upon when Paul and Barnabas were in Jerusalem, and they were called there to defend the reasons why they were now preaching to the Gentiles. As an outgrowth of that conversation, they agreed to take an offering. This gift, this offering, was seen as kind of a generalized reciprocity from the Gentile church to the church in Jerusalem, a thanksgiving of sorts. And in the setting of the first century, I think it's important to understand that within the Greco-Roman world, there was a deeply ingrained patron and client, benefactor and recipient social structure. Within this framework, family members and friends would do endless favors within their social group and within their family. And the God of Israel, like a patron, dispenses favors upon God's people, most notably in the death and resurrection of Israel's Messiah, Jesus. And the first witness to this divine benefaction were to be found in the Jerusalem Jesus groups, from which the gospel was transmitted. So Paul requests that the Corinthian church and the Corinthian group and others like it participate in this offering. and this offering grows out of that societal structure. Now, even though all of that is true, the most compelling reason that Paul encourages the members of this church in wealthy Corinth to give was in response to the overabundance of God's grace. This is where it begins for Paul. And in the end, there is no other reason for them to even think about joining their gifts with the gifts of other churches throughout the region. This is also where Reformed Protestant theology begins. It is God who has acted first. Everything else grows out of that understanding. There is nothing one can do to earn God's activity, God's grace, or God's blessing. So this grace, this ultimate and unmerited gift of God, should move us all toward gratitude. For gratitude is the only appropriate response, according to the apostle. Gratitude should be the first fruit of the grace that we have received. And when one considers the magnitude of the grace, this amazing grace, how can one's heart not be transformed from thoughtlessness to gratitude? This gratitude is the backdrop of Paul's argument to the church in Corinth. And this type of gratitude isn't simply a polite verbal response. No, the gratitude of which Paul writes is actually the transformation of the very heart of the recipient of grace. However, Paul doesn't stop there. His appeal goes beyond a heart that is grateful for that which the Jesus group in Corinth had received. Indeed, the abundance of God's grace should lead to gratitude in the heart, but that gratitude should lead us to generosity. And this is the center of Paul's argument. Paul calls the church in Corinth, and us by extension, to live lives that are characterized by generosity. Paul calls us all toward a generosity that is the living out of gratitude for the incalculable gift of God's unwavering grace. So this generosity then becomes a vehicle of grace to others. It's kind of like a circle. It's a witness to God's abundance, God's there is enough. One author writes, God's grace is powerful and moves the recipient to a reflection of God's abundance so that they respond profusely by doing good works toward others. God's grace, once received, generates grace-laden acts to others. Paul's assumption is that good works are not an option for believers, but a necessity. The author goes on, believers are free to determine what form the good works take, what shape love takes, but they are not free not to love. They are not free not to do good works. The good works are generated by God's grace, bountifully poured out upon believers. This generosity, the generosity of which Paul writes, is a generosity born of gratitude. This generosity is a responsive act on the part of the one who has received grace and is not a pretentious attempt to manipulate God to act. This generosity multiplies itself in the lives of others. The generosity of which the Apostle Paul writes is not just monetary. It's a willingness to share grace with everyone around you. No one is excluded, no matter what. Grace, the undeserved and audacious grace of God, births gratitude in the heart and the life of the believer, which in turn brings about generosity in the lives of those transformed by that grace, which then becomes grace to others. You see, in God's economy, everyone prospers. This is the gospel of prosperity where all might share in God's economy of abundance. This is not the popular prosperity gospel, where people are only selfishly concerned about receiving and keeping their own blessing. When one considers the magnitude of God's grace, how can one's heart not be transformed from a heart of thoughtlessness to a heart of gratitude? How can one's life not be changed from a life of self-entitlement to a life of generosity? It all begins with the gracious act of God. Generosity becomes the expression of our gratitude for that gift, but our generosity, our generous acts, are not bribery for God's favor or blessing, for both of those are already ours. Biblical commentator Ernest Best writes, "Those who give out of self-interest to receive a reward here or in the hereafter are reluctant givers. For they act under an inner compulsion to seek their own good. There is no genuine joy, only a cool, calculating self-concern." If giving loses its origin and purpose in God and God's grace, both it and our faith will shrivel and die. So our response is not in hopes of getting God to move. No, our generous response is because God has already moved. A generous life is a life lived not as a reservoir, but as a conduit for the grace of God into the lives of others. Popular author Anne Lamott wrote in her book, Help, Thanks, Wow, "Gratitude begins in our hearts, and then it dovetails into our behavior. It almost makes you willing to be of service, which is where the joy resides." Then in her typical fashion, she writes, "It means you are willing to stop being such a jerk. When you are aware of all that God has given you in your lifetime and in the past few days, it's hard not to be humbled and pleased to give back." There's a beautiful story of generosity and abundance that appears in all four of our Gospels. It's a story that many of us learned sitting on the floor in small Sunday school classrooms with a teacher showing us the story on a flannel graph board. But today, I invite you to look at that story again, but this time through the lens of grace and generosity. So the story begins with a large crowd gathered on a Galilean hillside to hear Jesus speak. And as the story goes, the crowd continues to grow throughout the afternoon as Jesus spoke. And when the sun passed the midday sky and the day started to draw to a close, the disciples began to worry about where they were going to find food for themselves and for the throngs who had gathered. They wanted Jesus to send the crowds away so they could be relieved of the burden. But Jesus challenged his disciples to find a way to feed them themselves. In John's gospel, we are told that in response, one of the disciples said to Jesus, "There's this boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what is this among so many?" After having the people sit down together, Jesus took what the boy offered, gave thanks, and then he distributed it among the people. And suddenly, where there appeared to be scarcity, there was now an abundance. Where there appeared to be not enough, there was now more than enough for all to be filled. Now, we're not told exactly how this young boy's small offering became enough for a multitude. But perhaps, just perhaps, the real miracle of the day was in the transformation of the hearts of those who had gathered. A transformation from selfishness to a willingness to share. From eyes that were afraid that there wasn't enough to lives that understood that if everyone shared, there would be more than enough. A transformation from a sense of entitlement to a heart of generosity. And from that grace that was offered from the Christ, gratitude spilled out into and then from the crowd, and generosity filled the need. And as we are told, at the end of the day, 12 baskets of leftovers were collected. Every year, toward the end of Niners, it's our confirmation program for high school freshmen and those who haven't been confirmed. We read this story of Jesus and the young boy who shares what he has and experiences this miracle of abundance. And at the conclusion of our time together, each one of the Niners receives a small brown paper sandwich bag and a marker. Each Niner then takes the marker and writes one simple phrase on the side of this bag as a reminder of God's grace and God's call toward generosity. And what is the phrase that they write? Share your lunch. We have seen it time and time again when God uses one small gift to inspire, to transform, and then grace abounds because of the gift of God's grace. In a really interesting book, Never Pray Again, Eric Clark writes, "The anxiety created by scarcity makes us grasp and cling. Living into God's economy, the conviction that there is enough for everyone means letting go. We have to begin to give freely. The practice of gratitude begins with generosity and increasingly grows more reckless and more joyful. God's economy is where grace and gratitude dance. And the tune of the song to which they are dancing is generosity itself." We have all been called to generosity, every single one. And generosity is our thankful response to God's lavish abundance. And this generosity is both an in spite of and a because of way of life. In spite of circumstance, we respond. Because of grace, we respond. So may the Holy Spirit overwhelm us with the overabundance of God's grace. And may we respond with heartfelt gratitude through our radical generosity, that all may experience the more than enough of God's love. May we each be willing to share our lunch. Amen.